All right, so a couple of days ago, the GOP House of Representatives put forward a bill under the leadership, the tenuous leadership of Speaker Kevin McCarthy, to condemn the horrors of socialism. Okay, so I got a lot to say about this. Obviously, I consider myself to be a socialist political commentator, so I think I would have just a little bit of rudimentary insight in terms of why this makes absolutely no goddamn sense whatsoever to propose as a bill, let alone to pass, with an overwhelming majority of our members of Congress supporting this, including an outright majority of Democrats. But here's what they say from Newsweek. Republicans mocked over move to condemn socialism. It's a waste of time. And listen, the most fundamental critique that I would have of this type of a bill, beyond just the discussions surrounding different economic frameworks or ideologies or whatever, the most fundamental critique here is that this was meaningless, okay? This bill has absolutely no teeth to it. It has no real policy implications. It is nothing but an attempt by the Republicans within the House of Representatives to be able to use this against some Democrats who happen to vote against this and say, look at these scary totalitarian socialists who voted in favor of socialism. That's really all that this is. It doesn't really have any underlying meaning. And if you want any proof of that, I will link this down below. This is the actual text of the bill that was put forward, and there are so many different claims within this that I could get into in detail to try to, like, I don't know, debunk them or put forward hypocritical criticisms of, some of these Republican hypocrites who are putting this forward and critiquing the, horrors of socialism and all of this death and destruction that has been caused by this. But I'll link it down below if you want to go read it in its entirety. It is honestly just ridiculous at face value to me, but I'm going to give you my take here in a second. Let's just read some of the basic details here, okay? So they say, a Republican-led House resolution condemning socialism has stirred up a chorus of criticism and mockery online as the GOP uses its new House majority to forge ahead with its agenda. Okay, so this is what they're choosing to spend their time on, okay? Doing a hollow, meaningless virtue signal against socialism, which can have a multitude of different meanings depending on which Republican you ask and what time of day that you ask them. It can mean everything from, authoritarian Stalinist policies to Social Security and Medicare to everything in between, okay? Or when the government spends money on anything, that's what socialism is. They don't have any real critique of socialism because they literally cannot even accurately define it, okay? But this is what they're choosing to spend their time on, not on the crisis of homelessness, not on the fact that we have 500,000 Americans bankrupt every year due to medical bills, or 40 to 60,000 Americans dying every year due to a lack of health care, the fact that a vast majority of the American people are working paycheck to paycheck, we have a decimated labor movement, decimated unions and labor rights in this country, okay? None of that, not tackling any of those issues. Let's just condemn socialism, okay? I mean, this is what they're focusing on. It's just honestly silly. But they say the resolution, which denounces the horrors of socialism and opposes the implementation of socialist policies. Again, when they say socialist policies, they mean everything, okay? And that's not me saying that. I'm not just pulling that out of my ass. I'm not trying to do a straw man here. When they say socialist policies, I have literally heard elected members of the Republican Party refer to every single measure of government spending as socialism, even though that has nothing to do with the real definitions of socialism, as a vast majority of socialists that I at least interact with understand it. But they're coming out opposed to the horrors of socialism and the implementation of socialist policies in the United States, and it passed the House in a vote of 328 to 86, with a vast majority, pretty much every single Republican, obviously voting against this or voting in favor of this measure, while a majority of Democrats also joined them and voted in favor of this measure. Okay, I mean, again, there's so much that you could say about this. First of all, the horrors of socialism. Listen, it's perfectly fine to have critiques of individual leaders or individual governments that have identified as socialist or communist throughout history, whether it's Joseph Stalin or Mao Zedong. You could have fair and good faith debates and discussions surrounding failed policies or, creeping authoritarian policies or whatever it may be. But to pretend as if those critiques are unique to a socialist economic philosophy philosophy or an ideological framework is deranged. I mean, how many authoritarian, fascist, right-wing capitalist governments has the United States endorsed and supported and armed and funded, okay, throughout modern American history? Okay, you could look to just Latin America alone, a couple experiments with neoliberalism or fascism or capitalism within a lot of these countries, and Chile and Brazil. I mean, how many different countries? Okay, Cuba is another example of that, the fascist, right-wing, extraordinarily violent Batista regime that the United States was propping up before Fidel Castro. I mean, so many different examples that you could give of either capitalist or capitalist-backed and funded and armed governments around the world, but they have nothing to say about that, right? Not the horrors of condemning the horrors of capitalism bill, just condemning the horrors of socialism bill, as if authoritarianism or any of these other critiques that they would have of what they categorize as socialism is somehow unique to this economic framework. It's so lazy. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous at surface level. And obviously, the underlying reality here is that we have a government here in the United States. We are living in the center of global capitalism, okay? We are the most powerful and wealthy country in the history of the world, okay? We are a fervently capitalist, corrupt, essentially oligarchy, closer to an oligarchy or a kleptocracy than we are to an actual democracy, okay? And they are critiquing this as if like socialism is creeping up in the United States. I mean, it's just like, it's so laughable, but this is what they're choosing to spend their time on. And again, it's not just Republicans, it's a majority of Democrats as well. They say of the Democrats, 212 representatives in the 118th Congress, 86 voted against the resolution. So I guess, you know, a shred of credibility to some of these people who voted against this obvious hollow virtue signaling. But they say another 14 voted present, according to Insider. And we have a quote here from the person who put forward this bill. They say, "It is a lie that socialism will solve your problems, economic or social. We cannot let this evil ideology take hold in this country." Republican Representative Maria Elvira Salazar of Florida, who sponsored the resolution, said on the House floor, she says, "We are in the United States, the stronghold of freedom. That is why we must pass this resolution." Okay, so listen, there's just so much that I could get into here with, discussions and debates surrounding, different capitalist economic policies or socialist economic policies. But listen, I mean, again, the fundamental reality here is that we have a bunch of corrupted politicians who are being corrupted by the capitalist class, corporate America, the billionaires within this country, and they are towing the line for an economic framework that benefits that millionaire and billionaire class. That is what these people are doing, okay? So this is essentially just McCarthyism in the modern era, okay? We are still doing this whole fear-mongering about socialism, which, believe it or not, at least for the younger generations, doesn't seem to be working. In fact, according to some polls, socialism is actually more favorable among younger generations than even capitalism, which I think is absolutely based and correct. So shout out to Gen Z and Alpha on that front. But I mean, listen, again, we have a entirely corrupted political system here in the United States that goes for Republicans, that goes for Democrats, even some independents as well. We have essentially allowed private capital to infiltrate and control our entire legislative agenda. That's not even just my opinion. You can go to things like the 2014 Princeton study that showed that there is virtually a one-to-one correlation between the wealthy elites in this country want and what gets passed through legislation, whereas there is virtually no correlation whatsoever between what actual working class Americans want and what actually gets passed through legislation. And so we have a massively corrupted government, and here you have a bunch of poser-ass, conservatives and reactionaries within the Democratic Party and Republican Party who are putting this forward to basically just give a nod and a wink to the capitalist class that is bribing them on a regular basis to say, listen, we're not going to do anything to actually materially improve the lives of working class Americans. We are still fully in your pocket. And so now I'm just going to get to my basic outline of how I interpret socialism. Now, obviously, you have to keep in mind there are many different interpretations and branches and definitions of socialism. You have, Maoism and, Stalinism and Marxist Leninism and all of these different combinations of interpretations of socialism, right? So with that being said, obviously there's going to be some people who disagree with this, but I'm just going to give you guys my fundamental, rudimentary, the most basic analysis of how I define socialism you could possibly ask for. I would say it's basically a two-pronged thing. Number one is essentially democracy in the workplace. Okay, so essentially under capitalism, right, you have what I would call fairly a authoritarian, inherently authoritarian system in place economically, where in each individual, corporation, you have essentially a totalitarian setup where a tiny minority, a handful of executives, or the CEO or the board of directors or the shareholders, they get to make 100% of the decisions for the direction of the company, for where profits are going to be invested, which typically nowadays is basically just on stock buybacks to inflate their stock prices and give more payouts to wealthy Wall Street shareholders, but also things like wages and working conditions and benefits and all of these things. All of this under capitalism is designated to a tiny minority of elites who get to make all of these decisions completely unchecked, and you have the vast majority of workers who are essentially having their surplus value, or under a capitalist economic model, what we call profits, that are extracted off of their backs and shipped off to all of these wealthy Wall Street or capitalist ghouls. Okay, so my theory of socialism in that sense within the individual workplace is, why don't we give a little bit of a democratic say to the actual workers who are doing the labor that provides the value that makes all of these corporations wealthy? Okay, so it's essentially democracy within the workplace. Each individual worker has a direct vote, a direct say within their wages, their working conditions, their benefits, and the direction of the company, and where they should be reinvesting profits in order to expand the production levels of the company, all of that, right? That is prong number one. Prong number two would be essentially deprivatizing or socializing a lot of different industries, meaning bringing them somewhat under a democratic government control, right? Obviously now we live in an incredibly corrupted government, so I would see why people would be hesitant to say, oh, well, we should have, the government control healthcare, right? Because our government is massively corrupted. But again, they're being corrupted by the private capitalist class, and it's a very important thing to recognize here. So the second prong, again, would be socializing a lot of these industries, particularly ones that tend to be inelastic in the market sense. So things like pharmaceutical drugs, things like healthcare, right? Healthcare is an inelastic market, okay? Everybody is going to need healthcare. If you're sick, if you have some catastrophic illness or injury, you have to get healthcare, right? You don't really have a choice. It's either get healthcare or die. And so for that reason, I don't think that it's beneficial to us as a society, specifically here in the United States, to have our healthcare system, or pharmaceutical system for that matter, be dictated by gigantic corporations whose sole objective is increasing their profit margins. Because what do you get from that? Well, here in the United States, we have by far the most expensive healthcare system in the world, both in a total amount and in a per capita sense, and we are getting lesser results. We have a lower life expectancy right now in the United States than Cuba, a supposedly evil socialist country that we have, by the way, had an embargo on for nearly 60 some odd years now at this point. Okay, so the point is, when you have an industry like healthcare that is being directed by the profit motive, you have outcomes like, again, 500,000 Americans go bankrupt every year due to medical bankruptcy. That is not even something that happens in other capitalist social democracies around, Western Europe. Okay, we have 40 to 60,000 Americans dying every year because of a lack of healthcare. We have essentially what Todd Kingsley calls, I think accurately so, a health insurance mafia middleman that stands in between you and your actual healthcare, you and your doctor, right? So there are all of these different industries like healthcare where Americans are basically just getting shafted and ripped off and denied basic services that are a life necessity for them to survive and to thrive and to help participate in society. And we have essentially dominated or allowed these industries to be dominated by Wall Street and by the capitalist class to the detriment of the vast majority of working class people in this country. So I would argue that the second prong, in addition to democracy being implemented in the workplace, would be socializing industries like healthcare, like our energy system, so that we aren't having, for-profit multinational oil companies, fossil fuel companies that are price gouging the American people for things like gas. Instead, we could be, actually democratizing this process and reinvesting a lot of the profits that come from the natural resources that we have, fossil fuel-wise, here in the United States, and investing that back and towards transitioning towards renewable energy as the future, creating millions of jobs, again, preventing the American people from being price gouged. There are so many different industries, energy, healthcare, pharmaceutical drugs, a lot of different things that I would argue should be socialized in this country. Housing would be another great example of that. And so that would be my basic outline of like the two core tenets of what I really just basically think about when I'm thinking about socialist principles. Now, with that being in mind, have you ever in your entire life heard an elected Republican or one of these mainstream pundits on the right given a response to that outline of those priorities, or even gotten into the basics of the conversation surrounding why our current system may have flaws and why an alternative, many of which have been demonstrated around the world for decades at this point, would be potentially better, right? No, you never hear that. Instead, we get bullshit posturing legislation like this, where Republicans and Democrats are teaming up to say, we agree that no socialist policies should be implemented in the United States. Well, what does that mean? Are we talking about no universal health care? Okay, continuing on the incredible, brutal system that we have right now that is, number one, the most expensive in the world, and number two, is delivering diminishing results to average Americans. So does that mean we're against universal health care? Does it mean we're against tackling the homeless crisis because that may or may not serve the interests of the bottom line of, Wall Street landlords in this country? I mean, what are you specifically talking about when you're saying we are condemning the horrors of socialism and we're also condemning, any socialist policies in the future? And a follow-up question to that, which I think would be, beneficial, is that, again, I'm perfectly willing to have conversations about the shortcomings of, throughout history, self-identified socialist leaders or governments. That's perfectly fine. Socialism is always going to be an ongoing experiment, okay? It is an alternative to capitalism. It is not a stringent, a set of points that you absolutely have to follow. No, you do a little bit of analysis. You, analyze the material conditions, the situation that you are in, and then you, try to apply it or make it applicable to any given circumstance, right? So my follow-up question would basically be this. If you're going to come out like this against the horrors of socialism, right, and all these failed experiments that have taken place around the world, well, the follow-up question to that would be, how about the horrors of capitalism, right? How about the Bengal famine that was caused by the imperial United Kingdom? I mean, how about, the Iraq War, which I think many people in this country would argue was primarily done over resources like oil, for example? How about all of the fascist regimes that the United States and other capitalist countries have propped up around the world, specifically to expropriate their resources, to take advantage of their labor forces, okay, cost them trillions of dollars, backed extremely violent governments that have killed untold amounts of people, enacted extraordinarily authoritarian policies within these countries? I mean, there's so many different things that you could analyze about the inherent flaws that come as a result of capitalism, especially the international monetary system that we have set up right now, and all of these different governments that we have supported in the past and continue to support to this day. I mean, it's just absolutely wild that they would be this brazen about it, to throw it in your face and do this, hollow of a bill that is utterly meaningless at the end of the day, outside of basically just trying to continue pushing agitated propaganda against an alternative to our current status quo, the hegemonic dominance and control that the capitalist class has over our country, our economy, and clearly our government.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying